Sapien.
Hey, everyone. What's up, Sapien Tribe? You're all part of the tribe in my book. Anyone who's listening is part of the team. We are back with our favorite Dr. Bill Schindler. Man, Gary and I can't say enough good things about this man. I actually see him a lot. I make it over to Maryland, and he has the whole food lab, basically, that he took over, does great events, does great content. Oh, man, there's so much to say about this man.
And really what this podcast is about is his book. Bill has worked on Eat Like a Human, which is essentially a similar concept to Sapien, and it's how we got connected. I think the book is so important, and so many of you listening, I know, are going to be my patients because I've already recommended it to so many of you. And I think this book is really important because whether you're just learning about, sapien diet and lifestyle, or if you're already into it, understanding the food system, understanding how to purchase food, understanding how to make it yourself, understanding what goes into our food system to make healthy food and to make toxic food is really the key to do this long-term and successfully. I think the book functions as a guide. I know personally, I learned so much from this book. I read it back to front during my most recent week away from work. I took notes. You guys will see during the episode, I had notes. We didn't even get to everything, but I really think we touched on most of the really, really critical stuff that I think people will take from the book. And I just encourage everyone to buy the book, support Bill. It's really, really an educational book more than a story about food. So check it out, listen to the podcast, let us know what you think, and reach out to Bill. He's an amazing guy.
Absolutely. Follow him online. I think we'll be doing some projects with him in the future, maybe even involving Mary Ruddick, traveling the world. We're going to figure something out because he's finding out how people do it and really live and immerse himself into culture. So great episode, brought to you by just us, no sponsors, just to buy Evolve Healthcare. If you're in Los Angeles, got to book an appointment with Dr. Gary. I can't think of a better doctor, man. He's my doctor. Actually, I don't know if we can say this. Is he Dr. Bill's doctor? Who knows?
I think Bill's comfortable sharing that, but yeah.
I think he may have mentioned it once. Yeah.
It's I'm so flattered, and it's so fun to work with him and with you, Brian. And, join the tribe, Sapien Tribe. It's our way of reaching out and building our community. Brian mentioned the program, and do not forget nosetotail.org, an amazing, amazing company Brian has put together. Amazing farmers that practice regenerative agriculture, the best, highest quality meat, and other products, which are great. You guys check it out. It's all on the website, and support us. We appreciate it.
Absolutely. And yeah, sapien.org was the site for the program and the tribe and all that. So without further ado, here's our man, Dr. Bill Schindler. Hey, we're here with the Sapien Podcast. We got Dr. Bill Schindler. What's going on?
How are you? Good to see you both.
Yeah, back again. We have Dr. Gary in the house.
Hello. And we're about to talk to one of my, probably one of our most special guests. We've had Bill on the podcast before, and I love talking to Bill. Last time we talked about bread, and we got to meet his wife, and it was really exciting. But today we're going to talk about your new book.
Yeah, listen, I am super excited about this book, and I'm super excited to talk to both of you. I know we've been on a bunch and talked about a lot of things, but I think there's a whole bunch of concepts and takeaway messages we can explore tonight. So thank you.
Absolutely. Yeah, so I have had Dr. Bill on a couple times to Peak Human. So we're not going to go through his whole story. He has amazing stuff about the history of eating meat, hunting, how our brains grew, food throughout history, tons of great stuff. We're going to jump in and follow the book a little bit because you have these main sections in the book. Dr. Gary wrote down a bunch of questions. He has the book as well. We both got advanced copies. We feel really special. And we're going to talk about your history some more. I think everyone's should be super excited about you because you're living the lifestyle. You did the human race. You were on a TV show for Nat Geo and lived it. And you can explain to us that in a second. You're an experimental archaeologist. You were a professor for many years up until very recently. You made me this arrowhead, actually. by hand. You chipped it away. If people should be watching the YouTube version of this, I still have it. I keep it with me by my desk that Dr. Bill made for me when we filmed with him. So you just are actually living the lifestyle, traveling around the world, studying cultures, making tools, making your own clothes. Tell us about the Human Race show. That's so cool.
All right. So, I forgot all about that arrowhead. I'm so glad you still have it. That's fantastic.
Yeah.
So one thing, we are living a lifestyle as best as we can. And I think that's really the focus of both the book and the message and all the teaching that we do anyhow. That it's, one of our takeaway sort of phrases is it's not about eating like a caveman. It's about eating like a human again. And that's a really important part of what I found out over the past several decades of not only all this research, but just being a father and being a husband. I was so long just trying to be focused on, this is the way people ate 300,000 years ago, 400,000 years ago. This is the diet that built us as a species, and this is exactly what I should be feeding myself and my family. And we tried, and we did it, and it was incredibly biologically nourishing, fantastic. But we foraged for our food, we hunted for our food, we were butchering, and we were making all fermenting dairy. We were doing all of it, and the house was a wreck. I mean, the house was a complete wreck. And we were a family of five. We still are a family of five. We're a family of five. My wife and I both had careers. Kids were into all sorts of different things. And it was incredibly difficult and emotionally draining on all of us to attempt to do that perfectly and still go to work and go to school and have the kids at soccer and basketball and dance or wherever else they were doing. So what I've landed on is this understanding, and we'll talk about the show in just a minute, because that was a life-changing moment for me. But this understanding that a nourishing diet requires a combination of both uh, nourishing our bodies biologically by the food that we eat, but also nourishing our bodies emotionally and culturally with the way that we're eating and the way that we're approaching all of it. And that striking that balance has allowed us to strike an incredible balance in our lives. So the great
In a
human
modern
race.
context too,
I'm,
right?
so,
In
I'm
a
before you
sorry. Yeah.
modern way.
before you jump into the great human race, I just kind of want to also mention something as a part of this intro. Like when I was going through the journey as a physician of trying to understand nutrition and trying to understand how we got here, for me, it was like a really important question of how did we get to a place where during my training I was taught things that are that don't connect with physiology and biochemistry. They don't connect with history. They don't connect with our appetites. They don't connect with the morbidity and disease that we see. Like, how can these recommendations exist? And when I came upon your content and got to know you through, all of our interconnections, that was honestly like your perspective through the archaeological record. That was the science that I needed as a scientist and a physician to change my recommendations, to publicly go to my patients and say, no, like these recommendations are wrong, and there's good science to support it. And it's not some feeding study. It's not looking at people's A1C and blood sugar in labs. It's looking at human history and looking at it
Sure.
through the archaeological record, understanding, the evolution of our brains and the evolution of teeth and the evolution of our guts, which is all the things that are at the heart of your understanding and messaging about nutrition. It's looking through real science. And when I say real science, I mean literally rocks and bones and skeletons and real things that exist that you can't make up, and you don't have to control this or that. You can just look and say, this, why is this happening? And then you come up with these conclusions, of ancestral eating and processing foods appropriately. And so I thank you for being that person. And you really were that person to really put it over the top for me. And
Wow.
it's really,
I,
I'm telling you, no, because we've had these conversations privately where you're like looking at me as a doctor that understands, but you, in a sense, created a doctor that can look through the lens of, science, but a different kind of science, not some, drug company, randomized placebo control study driven concept that has power and efficacy, but is not ultimately, all the science that exists, right? There's so much science that we follow as a group, uh, you know, that
Wow.
is not some pharmaceutical things. Before you get into it, what I want people to understand and see is this beautiful book. I just took the cover off. It's called Eat Like a Human. It's awesome. I read it in like 3 days. It's a great read, easy read, but it's just so full of information. I kind of wanted to give people some context before you started the story
Sure,
because the
sure.
way you put the book together is so cool. So you tell stories about your life that transformed you and led you down this path of understanding nutrition and sharing with people how to essentially put human food in their body. You then explain a lot of the history and the details, like some basic science, but just, concepts that you have to understand. And then the best part, and I think this is what I also want to emphasize, is there's recipes. Like you can walk away. For me, when I was reading the book, I was thinking about all the stuff I'm going to do in my kitchen when I get home from my vacation, which is when I was reading the book. And I think that's so important because a lot of the people listening already agree. They've either heard you on the podcast before or they're going to understand the messaging. But to start putting it into practice, that's our goal, especially with this podcast, is teaching people how to cook, how to shop, how to process information that's coming at them that might, go against what they're doing nutritionally. And in order to do that, you have to understand all of these details. So thank you for the book. And you intro it with this amazing story about you being on the human race. Tell us about that.
On the Great Human Race? Yeah, yeah.
The
So
great
this is
race.
the Great Human Race. It was a turning point in my life in so many ways. And let me start off by saying, um, when I was in graduate school, I was studying for my PhD, doing my PhD and studying for my exams, and I was drowning in books, literally drowning in books, and exhausted up all night reading day after day after day, and week after week. And my graduate school advisor, Michael Stewart, who's an amazing archaeologist, he pulled me aside. He said, "Listen, man, don't. Why are you stressing so hard? Like, enjoy this." And I said, "Enjoy this? I have never studied so hard in my life." And he said, "Listen, this is the last time in your life you're going to be able to dedicate yourself to just focusing on learning at this level. And life is going to flood in everything. You're going to have kids, you're going to have a family and job, and enjoy every second of this." And and the message came through loud and clear, but he was wrong, because doing the Great Human Race was the second opportunity I had. It was literally an entire PhD level worth of education and was shoved into 9 months. And we lived it. So real quick, for anybody who hasn't seen the show, it was a brilliant idea by National Geographic. They were in the show. We filmed about 6 years ago. It aired for the first time about 5 years ago, and that was really the height of the survival TV genre. In fact, it was so popular there were networks scrambling to try to figure out the next weird thing they could do with survival to try to make their mark. And they were starting to get really silly. Like they were taking and handcuffing people together and throwing them in the woods, and it was all people getting naked and all these other sorts of things.
Naked and
But
afraid.
yeah, there was all sorts of stuff happening. But National Geographic took a step back and said, "Hey, let's use this tidal wave of this everybody getting excited about this survival TV approach, and do something smart. And let's tell the story of our shared ancestral past." And the idea was they were going to take two people, and it ended up being me and my co-star Kat Bigney, and they were going to put us in 10 different places around the world, starting at 2.5 million years ago in Tanzania. At the time, they thought that was where the earliest stone tool technology ever appeared. It turns out it's 1 million years earlier, but at the time, that was the best information we had. So we were going to start at 2.5 million years ago in Tanzania and follow throughout 10 episodes throughout the series, new technological innovation, human or our ancestral innovation. And every time something new was created that allowed us to overcome something, or take a jump in some way in the past, we were going to stop there and live in each one of these locations using only the technologies from that particular time period. And my job, primarily as the experimental archaeologist and the primitive technologist, was to replicate those technologies, just like the kind of arrowhead that Brian showed earlier. those technologies so that we could use them to survive and feed ourselves, protect ourselves, and all that. So we started in Tanzania 2.5 million years ago. Went through Tanzania, we went to Uganda, Ethiopia, through the Middle East. We were in Oman. We went up through Mongolia, ended at Oregon at 4,000 years ago. And what was fascinating was, for me as a professor and a teacher, I I always strove, and still do, to talk about things I experienced. Right. I wanted to. I didn't want to just have read something in a book and then kind of regurgitate it to my students. I wanted to actually live what I was teaching. And as an archaeologist, that's really hard. I mean, we're talking about things that have happened thousands or tens of thousands or millions of years ago. And this was my opportunity. And I know in each case, in each episode, we only lived in each time period and location for a period of about 2 weeks, regardless of what was shown on the television. Each episode lasted about 2 weeks, and 2 weeks is long enough to be scared. 2 weeks is long enough to feel triumphant. 2 weeks is long enough to be really hungry or really satiated or really healthy or start to feel really sick. And that's it. And living these time periods was the opportunity for me to actually put into practice my entire life's worth of research. And it just so happens that almost every single prehistoric technology has something to do with food. So here I was replicating the technologies that allowed us to create the diets that created us as humans, and then went out and actually lived those diets and lived those time periods in all of these different locations. Now, again, a couple of things to just get out in the open. Number one, we were in a different, uh, uh, what am I, time period, right? I mean, we were in a different. The climate was a little bit different. Some of the geography, the plants, and some of the certainly different, but a lot of it was very, very, very similar. I was a modern, Western, modern American. We both were modern Americans brought up in the modern Western world. I grew up in New Jersey, stuck in these different locations. And as supposedly the expert, but somebody certainly from 2.5 million years ago watching me stumble around trying to make an Oldowan tool would have been laughing. But we made it work. And we literally just, really, we're the only two people alive that really has lived at some level all these different time periods that were so important to creating us as humans. And one of the stories I think is really important here that I didn't talk about in the book is about halfway through filming, we were in a swamp in Turkey. Oh my! It was the most miserable shooting this episode. And these particular several days of this episode was the most miserable of all of it. We're stuck in the swamp. It's buggy. It's nasty. I remember one night we were sitting there, me and Kat, and we had a fire going, and we're getting eaten alive. And it was so hot, and the air wasn't moving. And I look around, and for a second, I was so I just thought everything around me was so beautiful. It looked like there were jewels all around us, millions of these little jewels, little pearls, sort of reflecting in the fire. And it turns out they were spider eyes, million all over the place, right? So I'm in the middle of filming this episode, and we're miserable. And the head cameraman, his name is Luke Cormack, his job was to look at me through a lens for months and months and months on end. And he stops me and he says, "Listen, man, I got to tell you something I noticed." And I said, "What?" He said, "Every episode," he says, "I know you eat a healthy diet normally, and my diet now is healthier than it was 6 years ago, but it was a very healthy diet." He said, "When we start filming every episode again, which lasts about 2 weeks at a time, you look a certain way." And he says, "I'm staring at your face day after day, hour after hour, minute after minute. And as the days progress in each episode," he says, "your face changes." He says, "Your eyes brighten, your everything about your face is it just becomes vibrant." And I said, "You know what? I feel the same way. I feel exactly the same way." And part of it was the way that I was eating. I mean, I literally was eating the same foods prepared the same way as our ancestors were. And he could see it through the lens of that camera repeatedly every single episode as the days went on.
Wow.
I
That's
love that. But a second suggestion of why I think that's happening is the connection to the, and this is why I would like love to have an experience like this, is the connection to the primal nature of it all.
Sure.
Like when you rip, like so much of our lives, it's all about comfort seeking. You're trying to like create a comfortable environment for your family. You know, we just live so far disconnected from our biology that when you challenge yourself like that, and in that moment, like it's on you, right? You're the guy who has to do the things and decide how to survive and execute at these ideas while educating people on TV. It's a huge undertaking, and I just feel like, and I just connect that to when I'm, I guess, just with my medical care, when I'm like deep in it, you kind of everything goes away and it becomes this focus on, and I think there's a primalcy to it. I mean, I'm doing that obviously in like a this real world, but there's something that connects to that human interaction, and you're doing that with nature, with yourself, with like the physical. I just think that's so important, and people have lost it. They don't understand, and everything you're doing comes back to that you know primitive experience.
You're absolutely right. And we're sleeping on the ground and we're walking around barefoot and we're dealing with extreme temperature fluctuation. All of these, you're 100%. And so, story wise, are you referring to the beaver pond? Is that what that
That
story?
was so cool. I mean,
Okay. All right. So
look,
let me set
I
this
don't, I
up
don't know
because
if
this
you
is,
want to rehash it for the podcast, but or maybe give some highlights. But I was like, this guy's a beast. This is impressive. And the question to leading up to it is, did you think that was your idea? Correct.
yeah. And there wasn't a choice. Now, listen,
So
I
you
have,
you thought of that ability to trap the beaver. You thought of that
oh,
trap.
you mean, oh yeah, yeah. That was the only using the technologies from that time period and the specific situation we were in to that particular beaver pond, the resources around the best way. We're talking about. So we're in Alaska. It's we were at the time recreating or living a time period where we believe the ancestors to modern day Native Americans crossed the Bering Land Bridge, right? The Bering Strait at that time period was dry land because the ocean water was lower, so you could have actually walked across from Siberia without getting your feet wet. You would have frozen, but you could have walked across from Siberia to Alaska and then eventually down into the lower 48 area that we have now. So it was incredibly cold. We were hungry. We actually, fat was obviously something that we needed. Uh, we were near a beaver pond, and in order to trap the beaver, now if anybody's been near a beaver pond gets deep very very quickly, especially this particular one. It was the water that fed this what they had dammed up the stream that the beavers created this pond in was glacial outwall. I mean, it was freezing cold, and I was wearing clothes that I had made, which is brain tan buckskin, brain tan leather, which absorbs, I forget how much, but massive quantities of water when it gets wet, massive quantities. So if I had gone in there with clothes on, I would have come out with sopping. It's the only clothes I had, right? I didn't, and it would have been incredibly dangerous. Again, they wouldn't have let me die, but I probably would have came damn close and probably at least have had hypothermia. So the only way to get in this pond to set this trap that we needed to do was to actually get naked. And I start the book with this story, and I think it is important in this conversation because I, even to this day, have difficulty taking off my shirt. I'm in the best shape of my life now. I'm 48 years old, best shape of my life, but I still have this carryover fear, this incredibly poor body image from when I was an overweight kid, and a couple of especially some incredibly powerful negative things that happened to me at that time. That if I take my shirt off, I'm immediately self conscious. So here I am in Alaska with filming this show for National Geographic with surviving on stone tools and homemade buckskin clothes. It's freezing, and the thing that I'm scared about is taking off my clothes. And not because I'm going to be naked and reveal the entirety of me, because I'm taking off my shirt. That's what scared me at that moment, and I thought that was an important way to start the conversation with the book and let sort of just lay that foundation.
It's so good. Let's leave it at that because people have to read the story. But it really fantastic way to. I mean, I was it's this idea of living what you teach, and like leading by example. Like watching, just your content and just knowing you, it's like inspiring because as I learn more about food, I'm seeing someone who's able to execute all this stuff, who's able to find healthy food and cook for his family. And I just think that, that show sort of is an example of what you've continued to do with the rest of your career, really, or your life, is show people how to do it. And that's what we need, because we could sit here and argue about everything with all the people that argue about plants and animals and this and that. But if you show people how to live right, that's the most powerful thing you can do, I
I
think.
100% agree. 100%.
You started off also bringing up probably the most important concept about food that I try to talk to my patients about. Um, Instead of arguing about meat versus plants versus this versus that, it's more important to understand like how it's processed. So I think you've said it a lot, like not what, but how. Like, can you speak to that? Because I think every single chapter from here on in, that's the real focus, is understanding food is not just saying this is good or this is bad. It's understanding how to eat it appropriately.
Yeah, 100%. The idea is not to, and I'm not suggesting we lose that focus on the what we're eating. I mean, we should always be striving to source the most incredible ingredients possible that are if it's from an animal source, the animals are raised appropriately, they're butchered appropriately. If their vegetables are coming, all of that is still incredibly important. But what I'm trying to say here is that for humans is part of the equation. The what we're eating is part of it. What's incredibly important, we've lost focus on, and part of the reason we've lost focus on it is because the modern food industry is doing an incredibly poor job at this, and they have taken the power of food processing out of our hands. But it's also incredibly exhausting to even think about one more thing with our diets. But I'll tell you what, it is one of the most important things to think about. I mean, we're talking about taking steps to nourish yourself and your family in the best possible way, and it's worth our brain power. It's actually almost every single, I mentioned earlier, almost every single prehistoric technology is focused on food at some level, mostly food processing. So we're talking about the most brilliant minds of our species and our ancestral species, all of them focused on creating technologies to do something to our resources, to do something to that what, to transform it using the how, right, to make it as safe and nourishing as possible. It is worth our time and effort to think about these things as well. So when I say that the how, the food processing, we need to realize that almost all of the food that we eat requires us to do something to it. Right? And it depends on the food, it depends on us, it depends on a lot of things what that how is. But it's things like simple things in some cases, like it could be just cutting, slicing or dicing or grating or putting something into a blender or through a shredder can help something, right? Something very simple. Or it could be using heat to cook, or it could be leaching or detoxifying foods through something like that, or it could be fermentation or something. And I'm sure I hope we get to some of these things, nixtamalizing or co-eating certain foods with other foods, like eating it with earth or clay or with ash or with charcoal. That's the how, and that's the part we really need to focus on. And we can do, and here's the other important thing. Even though it may be just one more, you might think this is one more thing you have to think about or one more thing you have to do. The cool part is you can do it in your own homes. I mean, these are things that people did, our ancestors did in caves with stone tools and sticks and clay pots and fires. You can do them all in your kitchen. In fact, if you can't do them in your kitchen, then I would suggest you should question whether or not that's food you should be eating. I mean, if you need test tubes and lab coats and high dollar equipment to process the food, then it's probably food you shouldn't be eating.
And to add to that, if you can't do some of the stuff at home, well, like you're suggesting that everyone can do the techniques that you teach about in the book. Well, one thing I tell people is I'm like, even if you can't, even if you're too busy and you're at home or you're like live in a very small place and don't feel like you can do it, by understanding appropriate food processing, you can then go and purchase foods and shop or go to restaurants where they're doing the right kind of food processing. But you won't know that this restaurant that serves fermented sourdough and only fermented grain breads is superior on a whole different level than the place next door You won't know that if you don't understand the power of the how. And I think it's so important for people, even that don't cook or don't have any interest in cooking.
Yeah, 100%. So I'm not saying that in order to eat a healthy diet, you need to spend 20 hours of your waking day, in the kitchen preparing these things. Not at all. You can. I did it, and I'm telling you, I've backed off a little bit. Right? There is somebody doing it. There's somebody that's doing these things to the food. You just have to inform yourself to the point, empower yourself to the point where you know the right questions to ask. You know how to read the labels properly. You know how this food is made, so you could purchase it, whether it's at a restaurant or a grocery store, even at a farmer's market. Where, listen, the health food stores and farmers markets are fantastic, but that just because they're labeled a health food store or a farmer's market doesn't mean 100% of the food there is food you should be eating. You still need to question some of it. You still need to understand, talk to the food producer. How are you doing certain things? And in some cases, it means there's somebody you can buy it from. In other cases, it might mean there's a part of what comes out on your plate hasn't been prepared the right way, and you just don't eat that part of it, right? You eat the other parts of the plate. You mentioned bread, and that's one of the examples.
I want to talk about bread. I want to talk about all this. I love putting things together in high level stuff. I'm obsessed with them. Like, okay, here's the high level view, or like I'm synthesizing things. All the foods that are healthy that humans evolved to eat, there's some foods that require less processing than others, or complicated. Okay, meat, fat, organs, blood, we can eat those straight pretty much. Fruit, when it's around, we can eat that straight. Certain herbs, foraged, little like bits and pieces, we can eat that straight. Those are all good. Those are all healthy. And this should be this is the foundation of human health. These are the most nutrient dense foods. Then there's a whole class of foods that you go, oh, even dairy. I actually went to Costa Rica for Thanksgiving. I didn't talk to you about this, Bill. And we went to this mountain, little house with this traditional family making their own everything. They had all the animals and they did everything from scratch. They even made their own sugar from sugar cane. So in the coffee, they had actual like raw sugar that they made right
That's
there.
Great.
They made the dairy. Even the dairy is included. There's not much processing. I milked the cow. I was drinking it right out. It was warm and hot. It was actually a little too warm. I drank it so quickly. I'm like, whoa, that's hot milk. But you don't need to process it. And they made cheese. It was so simple. They just let the cheese sit a little while, and then they pressed it into cheese, and it was cheese. So, there's certain foods, mostly animal foods, and some key low anti-nutrient plant foods that humans can eat without much processing. And there's a whole class of foods that you go in great lengths you've been around the world talking about how long and how many processes and steps it takes to process them to make them safe to eat, namely the grains and all these different potatoes and different ways that they ferment them and do these things. So I was just thinking about the foods that have the most anti-nutrients and has the most potential harm to humans. Humans for all of history spent the most time detoxifying and doing all these things, the grains, the starches, the potatoes. It's mainly these starchy foods that people live off of, and in certain areas they had to rely on, but they spent so long detoxifying. Now we don't. We don't do the same processes, and you can tell us about some of these, but we don't do them. We do the fake quick way, and then that's why we're so sick. We're so sick because we take the most potentially harmful or toxic, anti-nutrient foods like grains, for example, skip all the processing that all our ancestors did, and then this is what we base our diets on.
Absolutely. Let me say something real quick about the animals first. So I had to. It wasn't a stretch, but you're so spot on with the animals that and the lack of need for processing with animals, that it became a problem when writing this book, because that how is so important in all the ways you just mentioned. But with animals, there's not much processing, right? There's not. In fact, if you look at the focus of our ancestors in creating technologies where animals are concerned, it's all in getting the animal, right? It's all in bows and arrows and atlatls and boomerangs and throwing sticks and all these traps and these things to actually harvest the animal, and then
Slice it off.
Once you've gotten the animal, you're good to go. You could eat that entire thing completely raw. And other than there is a little bit of an advantage with red meat to a little bit of processing, either cutting it up or a slight bit of cooking. But other than that, in fact, cooking organs, a lot of times you get less nutrients out of it. So the technologies our ancestors created in terms of animals was focused on getting the animal. But in the book, how I sort of reframe that how approach is that what we've lost is how do we approach that animal once it's dead, right? Now we're just focused on lean chicken breast, right, or turkey breast, and we've forgotten that the entire animal can provide a lot more nutrition than just eating certain cuts of meat week after week, day after day, month after month. So, 100%. I will say with the dairy, God, I wish I was with you guys for Thanksgiving. We'll have to
Mhm.
recreate that sometime. Raw milk is amazing, and high quality raw milk from a good animal is a trillion times better than ultra pasteurized skim milk or almost anything we can get at the grocery store. For the majority of for 60% of modern humans around the world today, we've lost the ability to safely digest milk, even in its raw state, and have some level of lactose intolerance. So I would say that what they did with that raw dairy and just even leaving it out and allowing it to ferment does. And I know when I say technology, some of it times it just means letting raw milk sit out for 24 hours and letting it ferment. It's very basic but powerful. That there is an advantage to fermented dairy over
Oh yeah.
just dairy straight out of the cow. But you're right. The plants, we spent so much time. And if you think about the plants, you mentioned fruit earlier. Yeah, we don't have to do much to fruit. In fact, we've done too much to fruit. We've made it entirely too sweet. It no longer resembles its ancestors. But as far as safety is concerned and toxins, the job of fruit is to attract animals to eat the fruit and deposit the seed somewhere else. The job. So in most cases, fruit isn't inherently toxic and has to require a whole bunch of processing to make it safe to eat. Seeds, nuts, legumes, all of that reproductive part of the plant, its job is to survive the digestive tract of animals and get deposited in a pile of manure somewhere else to create a new tree or new stalk of wheat or whatever it is. And it chemically and physically is designed to do just that and requires a whole bunch of processing if we're going to make it safe and also to allow the nutrients in those foods available to our incredibly inefficient digestive tracts. And then the starchy foods that so much of certain populations around the world have based their diets on today, things like potatoes or manioc or the like. That's for those plants, that's the energy powerhouse of the plant, right? So the roots and the corms and the tubers, we call them underground storage organs because that's where all the energy is stored. And when the seasons change and the top of that plant dies off or becomes dormant, what's under the ground is what holds that plant and allows it to survive until the seasons change back again, and then it shoots something above the ground. So all of the plants focus is on protecting that root. So they are often loaded with toxins. And a lot of those toxins exist in the skin because that's the barrier between the important part of that plant and the outside world, and to protect that plant from fungus and insects and other predators. So we need to be inherently cautious of roots and also of seeds, nuts, legumes, and that part of the plant. Again, that doesn't mean they have to, for many of us, be completely out of our diets, but they shouldn't be in our diets the way they're in our diets today, where we just don't even think about them. And we have the media, we have advertising, we have nutrition, all the nutritional world some of the nutritional world telling us, oh my gosh, eat whole grains and you're going to be fine. Eat potatoes without even thinking, and you're going to be fine. And that's certainly not the case whatsoever.
I think it's so important. You just mentioned so many good concepts, and I think it's probably going to go over a lot of people's heads because so many, so many of the general ideas that people have about nutrition, or at least that's what's sold to them, is the complete opposite of the truth, right? So we promote a plant-based diet over an animal-based diet. That's backwards. We kind of are fearmonger eating raw and less cooked meat. That's backwards. We encourage people to eat the rainbow of raw plants. That's not a good idea. We encourage people that, hey, you don't need to eat all that meat, but you could get all the protein from the nuts and seeds. We don't talk about it's so backwards that, again, it's for me and Brian, I think for a lot of people listening, you can pick up on all that. But the book does such a great job mixing the kind of recommendation or what you're talking about concept with some of the history as to how we got here. And I think I think it was like the animal chapter. You did a
Mhm.
really great job, kind of how did we get here, right? Because we have a completely backwards relationship with our animal foods, but it wasn't always the case. And I think that for people to sort of accept that red meat is good for you, and that maybe try to cook it rare, or eat nose to tail, and really embrace organ meat, I think it takes understanding some history so that they can really embrace it. And I think that was a really great part to the animal section. And then I love the conversation about offal, because most people, can you
Awful.
tell, just because I think a lot of people don't even know what that word means.
So awful is literally, the word awful means to fall off, or what has fallen off. So nowadays, when we approach an animal, and just picture you're in a slaughterhouse and the animal's been killed and it's hanging there, and all of the stuff that you take off of that, right, that falls off as you're going after the meat, right? Because we nowadays we're focused on the meat. The meat is what ends up packaged in the grocery store. So all the stuff that falls off, everything from the entrails to fat, all of it, skin, all of that is considered offal. Not awful, AWFUL, OFFAL. The organ meats, the blood, the fat, those are the things that we've screwed up our association with animals in our diets, and right now that is considered waste. Right? It's considered awful. But it really was the backbone of our ancestral diet, and that was, I'm convinced, and so many other, I know, that was the introduction of that into our diet is what supported our massive body and brain growth. And it's something. Now here we are in those bodies that were built on the backbones of those sorts of foods in our diets, and they're not in our diets any longer. And we're expecting to still nourish these bodies. And listen, we are relatively large mammals. Just that alone, we have incredible nutritional needs. But you add to that these brains, which is the most expensive organ in our nutritionally expensive organ in our bodies, and we have massive nutritional needs to a very unique and massive nutritional needs to support these bodies. And without including those ancestral foods in our diets, it's impossible to do it.
And for so many people, it's just they're just so not comfortable with it. And even if they hear a good podcast or something, and they're like, yeah, I want to try some liver, it's kind of a scary thing. And then going out to restaurants, it's hard also, because oftentimes they're going to make organ meats with a lot of sugar, or with
Yeah.
just various fillers and things that you don't need. So one of the best things about the book, you guys, is you give recipes, you give the
Mm.
background, you give the understanding of what and why you're going to eat, how you're going to do it, and then there's a recipe to execute. I think that's so important, because I grew up eating liver, and I watched my dad cook pate and have liver and onions, and we ate tons of cartilaginous foods, but people are scared of that. And I think a lot of people will lean on supplements, or whatever, like, here's my liver pill. But by giving people a very, very easy stepwise process to actually do it at home, I think it's really, really important. I thought you did, man. I don't know. Brian always, Brian also, but we were talking about this before the show, bone broth. We take this for granted. I drink bone broth all the time. And so many people they don't even understand how to cook it, right? You were saying, Brian, people
Well,
ask
it's
you
so yeah,
recipes.
it's so easy. It's like intimidating for people. But Bill can explain how to make bone broth in probably 45 seconds.
We actually, you know what? At the beginning of COVID, we did exactly that. We did a 45-second video on bone broth. I'll have to get you guys a link. This is what you do. You take bones and you put them in water. If you have the time and you have a little bit hanging around, if you throw a little bit of apple cider vinegar in there, just a splash of it, and let it sit for about put it in cold water. Put the bones in cold water, about a splash of apple cider vinegar for, I don't know, half an hour to an hour. It helps draw out some of the minerals in the bones and have them come out in the water. If you don't have it at all the time, skip it. It's fine. Turn it on high as soon as it comes to a boil. If there's any foam that appears on the top, just skim that off, turn it down to a simmer, and let it simmer. cover it and walk away. Monitor it now and then, but let it go a few hours at minimum. Sometimes I just made from Thanksgiving the turkey bone broth I had it went 2 days, went 48 hours. So some people will go 3 days, but whatever time you have, let it sit in that water simmering. And then this is a very important part. What you've created there is a nutritional powerhouse. I mean, it is absolutely amazing what is in that broth. If you've done it well and you've thrown in cartilaginous bones and connective tissue, and if you have access to feet, my God, throw them in there. If it's a
Chicken
cow,
food. Oh my God, yeah.
chicken feet. If it's chicken, throw chicken feet. If it's turkey, throw turkey feet. If it's goose, throw goose feet. Pig's feet, whatever it is. There's so much connective tissue and cartilage, all that in those bones that it just helps provide the collagen, and it's super thick and amazing. And then pull out the bones, strain it, and here's the important part: cool it down as fast as possible. That is such a nutritional powerhouse that if you let it sit at room temperature for too long, like if it comes out from super hot to try to cool it down, it takes too long and it just sits out. It actually can be dangerous isn't the right word, but it can be a place for bad bacteria to come in and try to eat all these foods and create something bad. So take it down and either put it in an ice bath or put it directly. If it's something small, put it in a different container, put it in the fridge, and just cool it down. And I'm telling you, that is the easiest. I mean, literally, all you did was throw stuff in a pot, add water, turn it on high, skim it, and then let it simmer. The work is being done while you're doing something else. And then here you have the basis for not only good nutrition, but so many amazing real traditional foods are focused and based on real bone broth.
Or you can add, yeah, like onions and carrots if you want, and some seasoning, salt, pepper, whatever you want to make it taste better and drink it straight. Or you could just use that broth as a base for other things. Like I make other meat, and then I can, yeah, just use it to cook the next meat, or put it, yeah.
And a couple really quick additional points that are important too. If you have a whole chicken, you don't know what to do with it, throw it in the pot and do that with the whole chicken. Because at the end of that process, not only do you have all that bone broth, but you have all this amazing cooked meat, right? And you can just pull that meat off. And the other, I always throw in a couple of bay leaves and a couple of black peppercorns at the beginning. But if I'm cooking a really long bone broth where it's cooking for a day or 2 days or 3 days, and if I'm going to add vegetables, I don't add them in until the very end. If you throw in
Yeah.
carrots and celery and onions in the beginning and let it cook for 3 days, it's going to get sort of bitter. So if you're
Gets
letting it go
mushy.
for if you do it at a 3 day or 2 day bone broth, the last 2 hours, 3 hours, throw those vegetables in and let them sit in there. And again, super simple. One of the other things that I do quite a bit is if I'm, whenever I'm cooking, there's certain bags I keep in my freezer, right? Ziploc bags, or you could use Ziploc or plastic sort of Tupperware containers or whatever. And if I'm chopping an onion, I take the skins and the ends. If I'm chopping celery, I take the ends of the celery. If I'm take carrots, the ends of the carrots. Whenever I'm trimming them, and I just keep adding them to this container in the freezer, so that by the time I'm ready to make bone broth, I don't have to chop up an entire carrot or an entire onion to throw in. I use the pieces that I have saved up in the freezer, and it's a great efficient way to do kind of a zero waste approach and make
I
this
love it.
awesome nutritious bone broth.
I do that. I save just T-bones too. If I'm eating a steak, I'll just throw the T-bone in the bag in the freezer too.
Yeah,
Just
and people.
yeah.
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, that's it.
And people are so caught up. Same thing. I'll save. If you want to make a little bit of bone broth and have a chicken carcass, great. If you have, but it is a little bit of time. There's a little bit of a time investment. So if you don't want to do it that second, throw that chicken carcass in a bag and put it in the freezer, and the next one, and the next one. By the time you have 3 or 4 chicken carcasses, you're talking about several gallons worth of bone broth you can make all at one time, and you throw them all in. But the other thing is, I've talked to so many people who are like, okay, I'm going to make my chicken bone broth, and then I'm going to wait, and later on I'm going to make my beef bone broth, and then my gosh, is pork bone broth a thing? Can I make that? Well, yes, all of those are things, but there's no reason you don't have to separate them, right? You can put chicken and your T-bone bones and a couple of pig's feet all in the same pot and make this amazing bone broth. We just started doing it here at the Modern Stone Age Kitchen. In fact, this week we're launching our bone broth line, and we have a poultry one, we have a beef one, and then we have one that we're calling the whole farm, which is where we have pork, beef, and chicken all in the same one.
That's so awesome.
There's such a t- the flow to the whole book. It's like kind of ends up being how to stock your fridge and how to eat or shop and cook in a sustainable way, because by the time you're done with the story you're like, oh man, I have nothing to throw out. If I can just implement all of this, I could be eating amazing dairy and making my own bread and all this beautiful stuff. And I'm obsessed with this and I cook all the time. And if anyone's listening that needs that next, to me it's this next level of
Mhm.
recommendations that I can't do. We've talked about even doing like a show about it, honestly, because a lot of these techniques are simple, right? They're so simple, like the bone broth you guys just described. I mean, one can argue all the cheese stuff you described in your dairy section, which is just amazing, amazing. It's simple. That was my note on it. My note was like, what? Like, this is easy. This is so easy, and I can make multiple things from basically one starter. And um, I think that message is so important. But I, as I'm listening to you guys talk about it, it's like the concepts are so far removed from what we are taught growing up and what we see on TV, and they're so overly complicated, and there's so much fear, like, can I mix these meats, can I do this, like, don't I need a big company to create this for me, you know what I mean? Like, there's this like disconnect between the simplicity of a lot of this and just a few key concepts, understanding basic chemistry. You don't even want to call it chemistry. It's basic human history, right?
Yeah.
I have a hard time with putting words to it because when I'm learning and reading about it, to me, it's this big explanation of like, what am I missing in my life? I'm missing this primal making everything myself, seeing everything from the beginning of life till the end when it's on my plate, and then using even the scrap, like all of it. It's the only way that we got to this point in evolution, but we're so far removed. And I think that when you just think about making a bone broth and when you ask these questions about can I mix meats or, well, how long do I do it? It's like, what do you mean? They just put
Mhm.
the meat in the bowl, added some water, and like when they needed to eat, it was time to eat. It was not that complicated. And I think that's like such an important message for people to think about. They just need exposure. Like they need to see the recipes. They need to see how it's done, you know?
They need to see. It's so right. Gosh, there's so many things you just said that I would love to
Mhm.
talk about for hours and hours. First off, the image that comes in my head as you were just talking is that late 1980s, early 1990s, Nike slogan, "Just do it," right? Just do it. The point is, just do it. Do not be afraid. Remember, our ancestors were doing these things without books, without microwaves, without without Vitamixes and all this. And look, we're here as a result of them doing it. You are, if you have some basic understanding of food and you source high quality ingredients and you pay attention to what you're doing, you're going to be providing not only the most nourishing but the most delicious food for you and your family. You're not going to be making them sick. We have the modern food industry. I'll give you an example in a minute, but the modern food industry has taken that power from us. Like they've disempowered us and made us think we require them to do these basic things to our food, right? To make yogurt, to make bone broth, to make cheese. Oh my God, making cheese seems so foreign. For all the classes that we do here, we do, butchering classes and sourdough bread class, a whole bunch of classes. And we do a cheese, every time the cheese class fills up like this. And people come in like, oh my God, I couldn't believe it make cheese. And I'm talking week after week after week. Everybody's coming in. Oh my God, I want to make cheese. I didn't know you could make cheese. Like, who the heck do you think makes cheese? Like, I don't know. It's just, we just think it's made. It You can make cheese, but so it's empowering to do it. It's what you begin to realize, you begin to connect, just like you were talking about, Gary. All of these parts of our lives and all of these things, just the past, the present, the resources, all of these things just start to connect in really amazing ways. And the word is just empowering. I mean, when you're educating yourself this way, you just become the most empowered eater, uh, food preparer, and consumer you can possibly imagine. And I remember as a kid trying to learn to cook certain recipes, and I remember Julia Child was my like hero growing up. As a 5-year-old kid, I would watch Julia Child on TV. My parents thought I was crazy, but I'd watch her. And I had all these cookbooks, and I remember looking through some of her recipes that seemed so difficult to do, not because of the execution, but because the ingredients were so difficult to get. Like all of a sudden I needed something like lard, or I needed, something weird over here. I needed, something over here. And in growing up in the 1970s and 1980s, if you needed an ingredient, you went to the store and bought it, right? And it's like, who's going to buy certain? But now, when you're approaching food from hey, I'm taking an entire joint of an animal or an entire animal in, or I'm starting with raw dairy and I'm going through these processes, what you realize is the ingredients in a real traditional recipe that may seem weird are byproducts of other things, like whey from making cheese or lard from doing something else, and that you just start to realize, oh, this all makes complete sense. Like the bone broth we just mentioned, a byproduct from making bone broth, depending on what you put in there, is at the end of the day, when it's cooled off, is you have a layer of incredible animal fat on top that, oh my, some people would tell you to discard. I would tell you to sit it on the side of your stove and cook with it every single day. And all of those things just start to come together.
Well, nothing's wasted. That's what I found when I went to the farmhouse in Costa Rica, or I just talked to an amazing guy up in Norway about this who has his own farmstead. Nothing goes to waste. If there's anything left over, it goes to the pigs. People always had some pigs and chickens around, and the pigs would eat it. So nothing goes to waste. Before we go, we have probably like 5 minutes.
What?
I want to get back to all those things I talked about, nuts and seeds and grains and legumes, and that they are they have anti-nutrients. I didn't want to say they're toxic. They have things, and we just don't do them correctly. So just because like Gary said, it goes over people's heads. They don't get it. I just talked to people in Costa Rica. It was like this healthy, like kind of yoga vegetarian place I was in, and they're just like, "What? What are you talking about? Like these are the healthiest foods on the planet. Like, what are you talking about? Grains, legumes, nuts. Like they have anti-nutrients." So just give us the overview, the 5-minute version.
It's 5-minute version. Wow, that's
save me a minute because I have like 2 or 3 other things
okay.
I have to mention.
I'll do the super quick version. I promise.
Super quick.
And I mentioned it earlier. Seeds, nuts, legumes, all of the grains, they're all the same, designed to do the same thing: reproduce viable offspring. And they are chemically and physically designed to do this. They are not put on this planet to nourish humans. They're put on this planet, in fact, to do the exact opposite. Now, do they have nourishment in them? Yes. But we have to do things to them to make them as safe and nourishing as possible. And the quick version of it is we have to trick it into thinking it's in the right state to let down its defenses and then sprout and support a new tree or a new plant or a new whatever. And depending on the nut or grain or legume, we do different things, and we talk about it a lot in the book, but we're talking about things like soaking or sprouting or fermenting or a combination of all of those, or even sometimes cooking in the case of certain beans, and sometimes cooking. But I will say, before we get onto the other pieces, one thing to really be aware of is that, especially in the case of nuts, but in all their cases, they are typically very high in oxalates. And I still have not found a really amazing way of getting rid of all the oxalates in these foods. So even if you're going through some of these processes, one of the best things to do is actually just pay attention to your consumption of them and not over consume, especially in the case of nuts.
There's so much to say. I just want to add that so many people come to me, they're not doing well. They've changed their diet a lot from animal products and have really increased their nuts and seeds intake because they're told that that's a great source of fat and protein. Listen, read about that chapter because it explains to you why you're struggling with nuts and seeds, why eating the same nuts over and over again, day after day after day, can be a problem for you. Oxalates, anti-nutrients. It's such an important concept, not given any attention to, and I think you did a great job. We're running out of time, but there's an entire amazing chapter, which I probably read twice, was about maize, about corn. Because when I tell people don't eat, I tell people don't eat corn. When they're coming to me with diabetes and they're sick, I'm like, stop eating corn. I say, no wheat, no corn, no sugar. Simple kind of like starter rule, right? But what's so fun as you get deeper into the corn discussion and you talk about this nixtamalization, if I said that correctly, but just the overall processing and the history with corn and how you can make it a healthy part of your diet. It's so important because people don't understand that when I say don't eat corn, and I try to emphasize this, it's like don't eat these corn byproducts. Don't eat maltodextrin and high fructose corn syrup.
Yeah.
And just there's so many other chemicals that are created as byproducts of corn processing. But there is a form of corn, like when you heard about the Native Americans eating corn as part of a as a healthy diet. It's because it was a different corn and it was processed in a different way. And again, I'd love for you to be able to sit here and explain the whole thing, but I wanted to, before we're done, like people need to read this and learn about it, because it's a game changer in it. Now I'm able to go and procure products because I know you explain what to look for in the ingredient list and that's
Mm-hmm.
so important. And the same thing with bread, right? When you understand the process of fermentation and sprouting, you're able to then go and find a local baker that knows. First thing I do now, because of you, I walk into a bakery, I'm like, do you guys have fermented grain bread? And they're like, what? And I'm like, oh, cool. I'll see you guys next time. You know what I mean? Because if they don't even know what it is, they may not have a
Certainly.
bunch of it.
Let me just say one thing very quickly. You bring up so many good points, and I wish we
This
had hours and hours and hours. We have to do some kind of a show because there's
long
so much
form.
we can do. But the what's important when we say the word sourdough, or we say cheese, or we say bread, that's that what part. And we can't base our conversations around a healthy human diet around those labels, because the modern food industry has figured out ways of skirting all of that. And we could all be talking about a different thing when we say bread. Wild fermented, slow fermented sourdough bread, or quick yeasted Wonder Bread, or same thing with maize. We could be talking about a certain, and the other one could be talking about a nixtamalized maize or a real hominy or something like that. Completely different foods, completely different nutrition, completely different safety levels, and completely different ways of our bodies responding to them. So the key is to understand how these things can be made as safe and nourishing as possible. At best, do it at home, but at least learn about it that way and then know what you're buying. Just like you said, Gary, going into a place and realizing this is real sourdough bread. If it says sourdough, it doesn't mean that it is. There is no regulation on the labeling of sourdough. There is no requirement that it's actually sourdough. It can just be plain yeasted bread that tastes
And
sour.
I think us talking about shopping and how to look at labels and how to then go and make best decisions. I think especially as finances get tough for people, people will
Yeah.
go and spend money on ridiculous food products because they have no idea what they're doing. And I think there's no education in how to shop. You made a book about how to think about food and how to cook it at home. Um, I would love. I think so many people need to learn how to shop. So anyway, just gonna throw that idea out there. I also, before we, man, there's an awesome section on foraging for your own plants. My mind was blown, and I'm gonna pick your brain about this on my own at some point. But man, I didn't know you can go forage in your backyard for plants that are just.
We got to
And
go.
you talk about bugs and protein. I don't know. There's a lot. Everyone should read this book. It's amazing. It really is, Bill. I
Well,
really think
thank you.
that's oh, that's
Wow.
good.
That's amazing. Thank you. I'm so glad you enjoyed it and found it valuable.
Oh, and so did I. And before we go, yeah, just give them the list. Give them the teaser version of sourdough. For example, if you see like citric acid or just
Oh
there's
yeah,
ways
yeah,
to
yeah.
look.
I was
It's a
gonna
very quick one. If you see the sourdough and it has what are the things that are the fake sourdough?
So for some reason, number one to understand is real amazing sourdough bread does not have to taste sour. In fact, if it tastes sour, somebody's done something wrong. But for some reason, because of the name, the modern food industry thinks that they can push something out to you that's just regular, terrible yeasted bread. And if it tastes a little bit sour, then you're going to think it's sourdough bread. So they call it sourdough bread. They make it taste a little bit sour, and all of a sudden you're fooled. Um, if it says anything on it that is sour, citric acid, acetic acid, which is vinegar, it could also say vinegar, or lactic acid. If any of those are on the label, then it probably isn't sourdough bread. Put it back. It's no better than any of the bread in the bread aisle, the soft sliced pan or sliced sandwich bread that's just a regular yeasted bread. It is not the same food. In fact, it is incredibly difficult, even at really high end stores, to find a real loaf of sourdough bread. You either make it at home, which, believe it or not, is a lot more simple than a lot easier to do than you can imagine, or go to a local bakery and ask them, like you were saying, do you have real sourdough bread? Are your grains fermented? And if they are, then that's a
Oh
safe bet.
no.
Well,
All right.
I did that really quick. I did that and have been unable to find fermented sourdough bread until a brand new farmer's market down a couple of towns over opened up, and I found a couple, and he refuses to sell anything that is not fermented, and I now have access to all of the delicious options of fermented breads. And
That's awesome.
that still doesn't mean I'm going to eat bread every day, by the way, but when I do eat it, I'm going to know that it's actually nutritious, real, high quality food.
100%. Nice. Nice.
All right.
All right. I got to try some of this guy's bread.
See if it stacks up. Yeah, Dr. Bill, they have their own bread with rye with his daughter Brianna. So that's awesome. We talked about that in the last episode we did. So go back, listen to that one. We talk a lot more about bread, but I just wanted to put that part in about the traditional processing methods. There was tons of processing methods. We didn't even get into potatoes, how they ferment potatoes or eat them with clay to detoxify them. But so much of the food today, we just think is healthy. We're not eating it in the same way that our ancestors did when it was healthy or fine. So that's a big message I want to leave people with. Eating nose to tail is a big message of Dr. Bill's. Knowing your food, I guess. That's about it. Anything else to wrap up, Bill?
No, I just this one thing, and I think this should. I talk about this in the book a little bit. I've recently been saying it a lot. This should be your goal. Every time that you get up from a table from eating, you should feel better than when you sat down. And I know I've said it to both of you before, and I'll say it over and over again. If that's your goal, I mean, the goal of food, eating the food, the manner in which you eat it, who you eat it with, how it's been processed, all of that should be nourishing, right? So if your goal is to get up every time that you from eating and you feel better than when you sat down, then that's the way it should be. I mean, the food should not make you sick. Food should not make you bloated. Food should not make you ache, should not make you regret eating it. None of that. You should feel better every time you get up. And if that's what you're striving for, then you're going to see improvements in your health that you can't ever imagine.
That is amazing. Most people, it's exact opposite. So I love that.
Awesome.
You guys, get Bill's book. This thing is amazing. I'm going to share that.
All right.
And, Bill, thank you for your time, man. Really.
Man, thank you both. It's always a pleasure. I can't wait till the three of us get together in person. We got a lot of fun stuff to do together. Important stuff.
All right, guys.
Thanks,
Take care.
everyone.
All right. Bye-bye. Thank you.